Welcome, welcome. Let's dive right in.
Ethan Cole had been working as a janitor at Briarwood High School for nearly a decade. He was quiet, unassuming, and never spoke much beyond polite greetings. Students barely noticed him, and teachers only acknowledged him when they needed something cleaned. Mr. Lawson, the physics teacher, often left his equations on the whiteboard overnight. Sometimes, when he returned in the morning, he found subtle corrections, tiny but precise, made in the corner of the board. At first, he assumed it was one of his more diligent students. But when he asked, none of them claimed responsibility. The history teacher, Mrs. Delacroix, once found a book from her personal collection, a rare, out-of-print volume on Napoleonic warfare, moved from her shelf. Inside, a single sticky note had been placed on a passage discussing battlefield strategies. It read, Clausewitz would disagree. See Chapter 7. One day, the principal, Mr. Donovan, received an anonymous email suggesting a way to restructure the school's budget to free up thousands of dollars for extracurricular activities. It was detailed, logical, and economically sound. It was so well written that he assumed it had come from an experienced administrator, maybe even someone from the school board. But when he asked around, no one claimed credit. The signs were subtle, but undeniable. Someone in the school was far more intelligent than they let on. And no one suspected Ethan. One evening, as he mopped the hallway outside the chemistry lab, he overheard two students struggling with their homework. "I just don't get it," one of them groaned. "If the reaction is exothermic, why doesn't the energy match up?" Ethan kept his eyes on the floor as he worked, but after a moment, he murmured, "You forgot to account for entropy." The students turned, startled. "What? Entropy?" Ethan said, still mopping. "Energy isn't just heat. Some of it gets lost in disorder. Look at the coefficient in your equation again." They exchanged glances, checked their work, and realized he was right. Ethan simply moved on, pushing his mop down the hall as if nothing had happened. But that was the first crack in the illusion. Word spread quickly among students. Some were skeptical, others amused. A janitor who knew advanced chemistry? It had to be a fluke. But then more incidents occurred. One night, the chess club was practicing in the library when Ethan stopped to empty the trash. He paused by their table, studying the board. After a moment, he murmured, "Knight to e6. Forced mate in 3. The captain of the chess team, a state-ranked player, frowned. "That doesn't." He moved the pieces, then froze. Ethan had been right. He turned to ask how Ethan had spotted it so quickly, but the janitor was already gone. Teachers started noticing, too. One evening, Mr. Lawson stayed late and caught Ethan at the whiteboard, adjusting an equation. "You understand this?" the teacher asked, stunned. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Lawson swallowed. "Who are you?" Ethan simply smiled, packed his supplies, and left. Curiosity turned into whispers. Whispers turned into theories. Students began challenging Ethan with random trivia questions. He never boasted, never explained, but he always knew the answer. It wasn't long before the school began to realize Ethan Cole was much, much smarter than anyone had ever imagined. The attention made Ethan uncomfortable. He had spent years avoiding notice, blending into the background. But now, teachers, students, even the principal, were watching him. One day, Mr. Donovan called Ethan into his office. "Ethan," he said, "I have to ask, why are you working here?" Ethan shrugged. "I like it." Donovan studied him. "You could be doing anything. Teaching, research, something bigger." Ethan smiled. Not everything is about ambition. But Donovan wasn't convinced. He made a call. A week later, a man in a tailored suit visited the school. He was from a prestigious university and had read about Ethan. He offered him a position, no degree required, just based on his sheer intelligence. Ethan refused. No one could understand why. Frustrated, Mr. Lawson confronted Ethan after school. "Why are you throwing this away?" he asked. Ethan sighed, setting down his mop. "Did you ever hear about Project Orion?" Lawson blinked. "The nuclear propulsion project?" Ethan nodded. "I worked on something similar once. Something classified. And it went wrong." Lawson paled. Ethan continued. "It cost lives. People I cared about. People who trusted me. So I walked away. I didn't want to be the smartest person in the room anymore. I wanted to be no one." Lawson didn't know what to say. Ethan picked up his mop again. "I like fixing things," he said. "Small things. A broken chess strategy. A math mistake. A budget. It's enough." And for the first time, Someone understood. Ethan stayed at Briarwood. He kept mopping floors, fixing equations, and leaving anonymous notes in books. Students still whispered about him. Teachers still watched in awe, but no one pressed him anymore. Years passed, and students graduated, carrying stories of the mysterious janitor who had beaten them at chess, corrected their calculus, or rewritten their essays with just a few words. Some would later become scientists, historians, or mathematicians, pursuing fields they had never considered before Ethan's quiet influence. And in the end, that was enough for him. Because sometimes, the smartest person in the room doesn't need to prove it. They just need to help. One autumn morning, as Ethan was changing a flickering light in the school's main hallway, a new face appeared at Briarwood High. Dr. Evelyn Carter, a former MIT professor turned education consultant, had been invited by Mr. Donovan to assess the school's curriculum. She had a reputation for identifying hidden talent, and after hearing rumors about Ethan, she was intrigued. "Mr. Cole," she greeted, watching him secure the light fixture. "I've heard interesting things about you." Ethan didn't look down. "People like to talk." Dr. Carter smiled. "I do too. About physics, mostly." That caught his attention. He turned, eyeing her with cautious interest. "I'm told you've been correcting equations on Mr. Lawson's board," she continued. "So I brought one of my own." She pulled out a notebook and scribbled something down. A complex quantum mechanics proof. She handed it to him. "Care to take a look?" Ethan stared at the page for a long moment. Then, with the same calm efficiency he used to mop floors, he took the pen and, without hesitation, corrected a single term. Dr. Carter's breath caught. It wasn't just right, it was elegant. She grinned. "Ethan, do you know what you just did?" He handed the notebook back. "Fixed a mistake." "No," she said. "You solved something I've been working on for 2 years." The hallway was silent. Then, for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt something stir inside him. Something he thought he had buried long ago. Curiosity. The need to solve, to create, to push boundaries. Dr. Carter saw the hesitation in his eyes. "I'm not here to recruit you, but I think you're wasting something incredible." Ethan exhaled. "Maybe," he admitted. For the first time, he wondered, was it possible to be both the quiet janitor and the mind he had once tried to leave behind? As he returned to his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, his story wasn't quite over. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for the next chapter. Ethan Cole had always believed he could leave his past behind. That knowledge, once unlocked, could be shut away like a book gathering dust on a forgotten shelf. But Dr. Carter's visit unsettled something deep within him. That night, for the first time in years, Ethan didn't read history or chess strategy. Instead, he pulled out an old notebook from his past life, filled with equations, unfinished theories, and ideas he had abandoned when he walked away from the world of academia. The next day, he found himself knocking on Mr. Lawson's door after school. The physics teacher looked up in surprise. Ethan hesitated. "Do you still have that problem from last semester? The one your students couldn't solve?" Lawson blinked. Then, without a word, he pulled out the equation from his desk drawer. Ethan studied it, then borrowed a pen. In less than 2 minutes, he had rewritten the solution, breaking it down with a clarity that stunned Lawson. When Ethan handed the paper back, he saw something in the teacher's expression that he hadn't seen in a long time. Excitement. "You should be teaching," Lawson said quietly. Ethan looked away. Maybe. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure what he wanted. A week later, Dr. Carter returned. "Made a decision?" she asked, leaning against the doorway as Ethan wiped down the trophy case. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the school, the place he had made his refuge. Finally, he said, "I don't want to leave." Dr. Carter nodded, unsurprised. "Then don't." Ethan frowned. "I thought you wanted me to go work at some research lab." She smiled. "I want you to do something with that mind of yours. But that doesn't mean leaving Briarwood." Ethan thought about the students who had unknowingly learned from his quiet interventions. The chess players, the struggling chemistry students, the kids who had been inspired by his anonymous nudges. Maybe, all along, he had been teaching. Dr. Carter reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "How about this? You take the certification test. You become a real teacher. Stay here if you want, but step out of the shadows." Ethan stared at the papers inside. It wasn't a demand. It was a choice. For years, he had hidden, afraid of what his knowledge could do. But maybe knowledge wasn't the problem. Maybe it was what he chose to do with it. For the first time in a long time, Ethan smiled. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." And just like that, the janitor of Briarwood High took the first step toward becoming its most extraordinary teacher.